The storm had raged through the night like a beast unchained, tearing branches from trees and flooding the dry ground with a fury only the west could summon. By dawn, everything was still again, eerily still, as if the world were holding its breath. And that's when Thomas Rourke saw her, kneeling by the splintered fence post at the edge of his land, drenched to the bone, her white dress clinging to her like a second skin, her hair tangled with rain and mud. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, eyes empty, lips trembling with something between fear and prayer. Thomas had seen his share of strange things out on the frontier. Men struck dumb by guilt, coyotes walking too close to campfires, even a preacher who swore he'd watch the sun rise backwards. But nothing like this. A young girl, maybe 16 or 17, alone in the middle of nowhere, barefoot and silent as a grave. There was no wagon nearby, no footprints in the mud, no sign of how she came or why. Only the cold, and her stillness, like she belonged to the earth and had risen from it. The townsfolk whispered plenty once the story got out. Some said she was a ghost, sent by the spirits of the hills. Others claimed she was the runaway daughter of a cursed preacher. But none could explain the look in her eyes, ancient and pleading, as if she carried the weight of a story too terrible to speak. What rattled Thomas most wasn't her silence. It was how familiar she felt, as if the land had known her long before he did. He tried asking questions, gentle ones at first, then firmer. But she wouldn't answer, wouldn't even look at him, just knelt there in the mud as if waiting for something, or someone, who never came. And deep inside, Thomas felt it too, a pull, a sorrow, like the past had crept back across his land to demand attention. This wasn't coincidence. This was a reckoning wrapped in innocence, soaked in rain, and left at his door. What followed over the next days would not only unravel the mystery of who she was, but awaken truths buried in the dust of that town. Because when a stranger appears out of nowhere in the Old West, especially one who doesn't speak, she isn't just a girl. She's a mirror, a warning, and sometimes a second chance dressed in white. Thomas Rourke didn't take kindly to mysteries. He was a man of the land, used to things making sense. Cattle moved in herds, fences broke in storms, and people stayed where they were planted. But nothing about the girl kneeling at his fence followed any law he'd ever known. Her dress, though soaked, was clean. Her skin, pale but unbruised. And her hands, though clenched in prayer, bore no dirt under the nails. She didn't look lost. She looked placed, like someone had set her there on purpose. He offered her warmth, bread, a blanket. She never spoke, not a single word. She looked at him once, just once, with a gaze so heavy it made his knees weak. There was no fear in her eyes, only sorrow, deep and endless, like she had seen something no soul should witness. That night, Thomas brought her into his barn, set up a cot, and left a lantern by the door. He didn't sleep. The wind outside groaned against the windows like it, too, was waiting for her to speak. By morning, she was gone from the cot, but not from the barn. He found her kneeling again, this time in front of his horse, her hand resting gently on its flank. The animal stood still, breath shallow, as if understanding something divine. When Thomas stepped forward, the girl didn't move. She just whispered something too soft to catch. It was the first sound he'd heard from her, and in that whisper, he didn't hear words. He heard loss. As the days passed, she remained by the barn, silent, watchful, unmoving, except to kneel in different places, the fence, the well, the oak tree near the corral. Always kneeling, always at dawn and dusk. The townsfolk came to see her. They brought questions, suspicions, even a preacher who claimed she was possessed. But when he tried to pray over her, his voice faltered. The words dried in his mouth. The girl simply looked at him, not with defiance, but with something far more powerful, understanding. And Thomas? He stopped asking questions. He began to listen, not to her words, she had none, but to the patterns, to the places she chose, to the rhythm of her silence. It was as if she were tracing grief back to its source, as if her presence was calling something out from the land itself. And deep in Thomas's chest, something began to stir. Not fear, not love, but memory. A feeling he had buried long ago under work, whiskey, and wind. One morning, Thomas awoke before sunrise to find the girl not outside, but in his kitchen, sitting at the table, dry now, hair brushed back, her hands folded in front of her. She still didn't speak, but her presence filled the room like smoke. He poured her tea. She accepted it with a nod. It was the closest they had come to conversation, and it felt weightier than any words he could have mustered. She drank slowly, as though each sip peeled away layers of frost inside her. By midday, something changed. A rider came tearing down the trail, Eli Trask, the deputy. Face pale, voice cracking, he burst through the door. "There's been a body found," he said. "Young woman. Out by Dry Creek." Thomas didn't need to ask who, but when he turned to the girl, she was still sitting there. Calm, whole, breathing. Eli never even noticed her. His eyes passed right over the spot she sat, like she didn't exist. Thomas felt his blood chill. That night, he rode to Dry Creek. And sure enough, there she was. Same dress, same face, but lifeless. Wrapped in a blanket by the sheriff's man, her features peaceful but unmistakable. The men spoke in hushed tones about what might have happened. A runaway, a tragedy, a tale no one would solve. But Thomas didn't stay long. He galloped back home with fire in his chest, unsure whether he was chasing the truth or running from it. When he arrived, the girl was gone. Her cot, cold. The lantern, extinguished. But on the barn floor, near the spot she had once kneeled, lay a single braid of wet hair, tied with twine, resting beside a dried bundle of sage. It wasn't an offering. It was a sign. And for the first time since she arrived, Thomas wept. Not out of fear or sorrow, but release. Because somehow, he knew the truth. She hadn't come for help. She had come for closure. The following days felt lighter. The air, clearer. The animals calmer. Something had passed through his land. Not just a storm, not just a ghost, but a spirit in search of recognition. And maybe, just maybe, in the silence she brought, she had spoken more clearly than any voice could. A message for all who carried buried pain. That even the most forgotten stories deserve to be heard. And that sometimes, they return not to haunt us, but to heal. Word of what happened spread slowly at first. A whisper between barbershop chairs. A murmur over fence lines. Folks were hesitant to speak too loud, almost as if naming the event might break its fragile meaning. But they all knew. Something sacred had happened on Thomas Rourke's land. Something beyond explanation. And in a town where tales were as common as dust, this one carried a different weight. It didn't ask for belief. It demanded reflection. At the saloon, where cowhands usually laughed too loud and drank too hard, the talk turned quiet. A grizzled prospector named Benji swore he saw the girl once before, years ago, out past Widow's Ridge. Said she appeared beside a dying Mustang and placed her hand on its flank until it stopped shaking. Others called him drunk, but no one laughed. Not this time, because deep down, they all remembered someone, a daughter, a sister, a wife, who vanished too soon, too silently. Back at the ranch, Thomas moved slower now. Not from age or fatigue, but reverence. Every time he crossed a threshold or tied a rope, he felt her presence. Not haunting, hallowing. He found himself fixing things he'd let rot. The gate near the stream, the old church bell, even a broken headstone in the overgrown plot behind the barn. She had reminded him, without saying a word, that some things still needed mending. Not with nails, but with remembrance. One morning, a stranger rode in, a woman draped in a traveler's cloak, eyes sunken from sleep or sorrow. She asked about the girl, not by name, but by feeling. "Did you see her too?" she asked. Thomas nodded. She broke down in his arms, sobbing into his shoulder with the weight of years. Her name was Grace, the girl's sister. She had searched for her across counties and deserts, following stories, chasing shadows, until the silence brought her here. Grace stayed for 3 days. She walked the land where her sister had knelt, touched the tree where she had prayed, sat in the kitchen where she had sipped tea without words. And when she left, she took nothing, only the braid of hair, the bundle of sage, and the comfort of knowing her sister had been seen, honored, and finally released. As she rode off into the horizon, Thomas knew he would never see her again. But he also knew he didn't need to. Her part was done, and the story, their story, would remain. Quiet, sacred, alive. The seasons changed, as they always did. Summer burned the hills golden. Autumn returned with its red hush. Winter dusted the rooftops like old memories. But the land didn't forget. Neither did the people. They began to leave offerings near Thomas's fence, not because they believed in ghosts, but because they believed in grace. A child's drawing, a folded letter, a broken locket. The girl had become something more than a mystery. She had become a symbol of sorrow seen, of stories honored. The preacher who once stumbled over his prayer returned one morning before dawn. He knelt where she had first appeared, hat in hand, and whispered a psalm, not for forgiveness, but for courage. And as the light crept over the hills, Thomas watched from his porch, heart heavy with peace. He knew now, her silence hadn't been empty. It had been a gift, a mirror to every unspoken ache buried in the bones of the land. Young folks who had once feared the dark now came to sit by the oak tree where she once kneeled. They brought journals, guitars, even small fires. They didn't call it worship. They called it remembering. And in a town that had once chased away anything unfamiliar, this remembering felt like redemption. Like the West was finally softening, not in weakness, but in wisdom. Thomas, older now, spent more time with the school children. He told them about weather, cattle, and stars. But sometimes, when the wind was just right and the day quiet enough, he told them about her. He didn't use her name, for she had never spoken it, but he described her eyes, her silence, her strength. He told them how she arrived, how she changed him, and how she left without ever leaving. The children listened, wide-eyed and reverent. They understood more than most adults ever had. And on the first day of spring each year, without anyone planning it, the town would grow quiet. Doors opened, voices softened. People would pause near the fence where it all began. And whether they knelt or not, whether they believed or not, they all felt it, the hush of something holy, a presence, a memory, a girl in white, soaked from rain, reminding them that healing often arrives not with thunder, but with silence, grace, and the courage to kneel. It had been nearly 5 years since the morning Thomas found her, and still, her memory clung to the town like smoke after a fire. Not thick, not choking, but constant, invisible and sacred. Some said she was an angel. Others, a spirit returned to finish a journey. But Thomas no longer questioned it. He had lived long enough to know that the West was a land carved by mysteries, and not all of them were meant to be solved. Some were meant to be carried. He had kept the small room in the barn untouched. The cot remained, the old lantern beside it, and the worn blanket folded at the edge. Occasionally, a traveler would ask for shelter, and Thomas would guide them to that space. Without fail, every one of them spoke of strange dreams after sleeping there, of wide plains, of weeping women, of white dresses and quiet songs that had no words. And when they left, they always seemed lighter, as if some unseen burden had been lifted. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the wind whispered low through the trees, Thomas sat by the fire with an old friend, Jed Mallory. They hadn't spoken in months. Jed, like most men in town, hadn't believed the story at first. But now, he listened in silence, his hands trembling around a chipped mug. After a long pause, he confessed he had lost a daughter too. Ran off at 15. Never came back. He had never told a soul. But now, beside the fire, he wept. And in that weeping, something shifted. The tale of the soaked girl became more than legend. It became permission, a sacred key. People began to share what they'd hidden, regrets, losses, wounds long ignored. Fathers who had failed, wives who had waited, children who had grown up with questions instead of answers. And somehow, in her silence, that girl had given them the language they'd never had, the courage to speak through the ache. It wasn't just about where she came from anymore. It was about why she came. Maybe she had been real, maybe not. But what was undeniable was the way she cracked the shell around an entire town's heart. With her soaked dress, her kneeling posture, and her gaze like the desert after rain, unrelenting, silent, and full of life yet to come. And in her wake, people didn't just remember. They began to feel, truly feel. And in the West, that was a revolution all its own. Years passed, and Thomas grew older. The silver in his beard gave way to white, and the strength in his arms slowly yielded to time. But even as age dimmed his step, his memory remained sharp, especially when it came to her. Every now and then, he'd catch himself glancing at the edge of the fence, expecting to see her there again, kneeling, silent, watching the horizon. And though she never returned, her presence never left. Children born after her passing would sit cross-legged at his feet, begging for the story. "Tell us again, Mr. Rourke," they'd say. "Tell us about the Rain Girl." And he would, not always the same way. Sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with awe, but always with truth. Because her story, unlike most Western tales of guns and grit, wasn't built on violence. It was built on presence, on what it means to be truly seen in a world too busy to notice. One autumn evening, when the wind carried the scent of dried grass and wood smoke, Thomas wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to her. He placed it on the barn floor, just beside the old cot. In it, he thanked her for the silence, for the questions, for the healing she brought without asking for anything in return. He signed it simply, Tr, the man who listened. The next morning, the letter was gone, and in its place a single white feather. Eventually, Thomas passed on, not in a bed, but on his porch, eyes turned toward the sunset. The townspeople buried him beneath the oak tree near the corral, just a few steps from where she once knelt. And when they did, no preacher spoke. Instead, they held silence, a long, reverent, aching silence, the kind that says more than any sermon could. And when the wind picked up, carrying leaves in wide circles, many swore they saw the faint shape of a girl in white watching from the fence line. To this day, no one knows where she came from, and maybe that's the point. The West was never about answers. It was about echoes, about the stories we pass on, not because they are easy to believe, but because they help us remember who we are when no one's watching. And if you ever ride through that quiet stretch of land where the sage grows thick and the barn still stands, you may hear it too, the faint sound of rain and the hush of something holy kneeling by the fence. As the decades rolled forward, the story of the girl became more than just a tale whispered over fence rails or around hearth fires. It became a part of the land itself. Travelers who passed through town felt it before they heard it. A hush in the wind, a chill at the fence post. Locals never warned them, never explained. They let the land do the talking. Because anyone who stayed long enough felt it. That sacred quiet, that memory carved into soil and sky. A small wooden sign was eventually placed near the oak tree where Thomas had been buried. It didn't mention his name or the girl's. It simply read, seen, heard, remembered. No one claimed authorship, but no one questioned its presence either. Every year, new hands repainted the letters before they faded. It became tradition, unspoken, like everything else in the story. Not a memorial, but a continuation, a promise to not forget. Young couples began to bring their children to the fence line, not to frighten them with ghost stories, but to teach them reverence. This is where silence spoke, they'd say. This is where we learn to feel again. And those children, too young to know the weight of grief, felt it nonetheless. The story passed into them, not through books or sermons, but through wind and soil and the rhythm of footsteps that always slowed when they approached that sacred place. A local schoolteacher started including the tale in her lessons, not as history, but as heart. "We don't know her name," she would tell her students, "but we know her purpose." And the children would draw her, always in white, always kneeling, sometimes surrounded by birds, sometimes by stars. Each image different, yet the same. And year after year, those pictures were pinned on the classroom wall, a quiet gallery of innocence remembered. And so, the land endured. The story lived. Long after names had been lost to time and trails had turned to asphalt, people still paused at the fence line. Some cried, some smiled, but all of them felt it. That moment when the world had been still enough to listen. When a girl appeared without warning, carrying more silence than 1,000 voices. And in that silence, healed a man, healed a town, and reminded the West that even in a land of dust and iron, grace could still kneel beside the broken and stay a while. Years turned to generations, and still the girl in white was never forgotten. Her legend evolved, not into something supernatural, but something deeply human. Writers came, hoping to pen the definitive account. They asked questions, interviewed elders, traced maps and timelines. But they always left with more wonder than facts. Because the truth, as the townfolk knew, didn't live on paper. It lived in pauses, in glances toward the barn, in stories passed between hearts. Eventually, a museum was built, modest, more wood than glass, more stories and artifacts. At its center stood a quiet display. The cot, the lantern, and the braid of hair, preserved beneath a simple pane of glass. There was no plaque with explanations, just a single phrase etched in brass. She taught us how to listen. Visitors often cried at the sight of it, not because it was sad, but because it felt like home. People came from all corners of the country, some out of curiosity, others carrying grief of their own. A father who had lost a daughter, a woman who'd never found closure with her sister, a man who had never spoken to the child he left behind. They came, they stood, they knelt, and somehow, in that quiet space between memory and presence, something shifted in them, the way it once had in Thomas. Old letters, once hidden in drawers, began to appear. Anonymous confessions, apologies, prayers, dozens of them, all placed beneath the oak tree. No one organized this. No one announced it. But the ground became sacred. It soaked up pain and gave back peace. And with each passing year, the tradition grew, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. A shared acknowledgement that some things must be felt to be understood. And if you ever happen to visit that quiet corner of the world, they say you might still catch a glimpse, not of the girl herself, but of something like her, a presence in the air just before dusk, a glimmer at the fence when the first rain begins to fall. You won't hear footsteps. You won't hear words. Only silence. Heavy, healing, and full. And in that silence, you'll understand what so many before you have come to know. That sometimes the loudest story the West ever told was the one that never made a sound. Time wore on, but some things in that town refused to fade. The fence, though weathered and worn, still stood strong. The barn, patched with care over the years, remained a sanctuary not for animals, but for stories. Even the old cot, now behind glass, still carried a kind of weight, the weight of her presence. And though no one alive could say they saw her with their own eyes anymore, everyone seemed to feel her, especially in the quiet moments just before the sun disappeared behind the hills. A boy named Samuel once came through with his father, just passing through, heading west. He wasn't interested in museums or stories, just restless to ride. But something about the place drew him in. He wandered away from the road, past the corral, and toward the oak. And there, without understanding why, he sat. He didn't speak. He didn't move. And when his father found him an hour later, the boy said only this: she was crying. But not because she was sad, because she was remembered. That moment changed Samuel. Years later, he returned as a grown man, a painter by then. He stayed a season, painting landscapes, portraits, and eventually, her. His canvas didn't try to capture her face. Instead, it held a rain-soaked dress, a hand on splintered wood, and a sky heavy with memory. The painting was hung in the town hall, and beside it, he wrote, "Some stories cannot be seen, only felt." She was one of them. The town never touched the frame again. Meanwhile, in dusty attics and weather-worn journals, her story appeared again and again. Different hands, different voices, but the same truth. Some said she was the soul of the land. Others, the echo of forgotten women whose stories were never told. But no matter how the words were shaped, the meaning stayed the same. She came not to haunt, but to heal. And in a world where most passed each other unseen, she made us look again. And so, she endured, not through miracles or monuments, but through memory, through the hush that fell when someone mentioned her name, through the strength people found when they thought they had none, through the understanding that even the West, wild and cruel as it could be, still had room for grace. And in every fence line, every storm, every bowed head, she lingered, the girl who came from nowhere and taught a town how to feel again. There came a day, nearly a century after Thomas Rourke's passing, when the town decided to stop retelling the story and simply live it. They no longer held formal gatherings or festivals. No speeches, no banners, just a shared understanding, passed from hand to hand. That kindness needed no ceremony. That presence was more powerful than performance. And that sometimes the most sacred things arrived without permission or explanation. The museum remained, though fewer visited it now. Not because interest faded, but because the story had outgrown the building. It had moved into the fields, the fences, the way people treated each other on the street. Newcomers could sense it, a gentleness, a patience, a reverence that felt woven into the town's soil. They often couldn't say why, but they stayed. And slowly, they learned. A young girl named Clara, who had grown up hearing only bits and pieces of the tale, finally asked her grandmother, was she real? Her grandmother smiled, eyes full of the kind of wisdom born only of silence. She was more than real, she said. She was true. That night, Clara took her notebook and wrote for hours. Not about the girl, but about how it feels to be seen, to be heard, to be loved without needing to explain why. And somewhere, perhaps not far from where it all began, a breeze stirred near the old fence. A soft wind that carried with it the scent of rain, even though the sky was clear. A rustle of leaves, a flicker of white among the sagebrush. Nothing loud, nothing certain, but enough to make a passerby pause, remove their hat, and feel something unexplainable settle in their chest. Because in the end, hers was not the kind of story that ends. It was the kind that continues, in quiet glances, in unexpected kindness, in a hush of memory that speaks louder than words. And for as long as there are hearts willing to listen, she will be there, kneeling, waiting, watching, not to be understood, but to remind us that every soul, no matter how lost, deserves to be seen and remembered. Some stories are too quiet to be shouted, too sacred to be fully understood, but they settle into us nonetheless. The tale of the soaked girl kneeling by the fence didn't end when she vanished, nor when Thomas Rourke passed, nor even as the years swept over that stretch of forgotten land. Because what she left behind was never about her name or her past. It was about what she awakened, a kind of knowing that cannot be taught in words, only felt in the silence between them. She was never loud, never demanding. And yet, through stillness alone, she changed a town, not with a miracle, but with a presence that reminded each person of what they had buried. Grief left unspoken, love never voiced, guilt never faced. In her, they saw their own unfinished stories. And perhaps that is what made her unforgettable. Not because she was different, but because she was all of us, in the rain, in the waiting, in the hope of being seen. The West has always been a place for legends, full of gunfire, dust, and men carving their fate into the horizon. But her story rewrote what strength looked like. It taught us that true power sometimes arrives without boots or bullets, but with bare feet and silence. That the fiercest bravery can be found in standing still, not to fight, but to feel. And in a world that often looks away, her story teaches us to look closer. So maybe the real question isn't where she came from, but why she chose that fence, that man, that moment. And maybe the answer is simpler than we think, because someone was finally willing to listen. And maybe now it's your turn to listen to the unspoken in your own life, to sit with your own silence, to notice who's kneeling beside your fence, invisible, perhaps, but waiting all the same. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you pause in a way you weren't expecting, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that breathe beneath the surface. Like the video if it made you feel anything real. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, healing begins with a single sentence, left by someone brave enough to say, I remember too.